Right, I can start. Yay, recording in progress. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ellen Wood, and I'll be your host for this session. We're thrilled to have you here with us for today's webinar, Beyond the Specs, Unveiling the Hidden Factors in Material Handling Solution Selection. Over the next hour, we'll be diving into some of these often overlooked project risks and how to avoid them. As we're letting some last-minute stragglers join us before we begin, a couple quick housekeeping notes. We are recording the session, and you will have access to the recorded webinar after the event if you'd like it. Please use the question and answer box to submit any questions during the session, and Mahika will be sharing those with us at the end, and we'll do some Q&A. And if you experience any technical issues throughout the webinar, please feel free to message us in the chat, and we'll try and get that resolved right away. I'm excited to get started. So let's introduce our speakers for today. We have Kate Davis and Sam Dorsa. Kate?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Kate Davis, Business Development Manager for Miebach and Pharma and Life Sciences Lead for North America. So been with the company for about 9 years now. My background is in industrial engineering, and I started my career with our engineering team and do most of my project work there. So very nice to meet you all today. Thanks for joining.
Hi, everybody. Sam Dorsa with Miebach. Been with the company for 8 years now. My current role is the fashion apparel industry lead, similar to Kate, but a different industry. My experience is also within the engineering department at Miebach Consulting. So this is covering all services from facility concept design all the way down through implementation. And we're certainly looking forward to sharing our experiences and some of the pitfalls that we've seen and unfortunately lived through a couple of times as well to make sure that all of you who are able to join can hopefully help avoid some of these things.
Right, with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to hop off video and let you two take it.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. All right, so before we jump into it, I wanted to give a little bit of background on who is Miebach, what do we do, why are we talking to you today? So a little bit of overview on the company here. We've been around for over 50 years now, and we are a global company. So about 550 people located in 27 offices around the world. And we cover a broad range of industries. So we have a couple case studies today that will highlight a couple of those different types of companies that we work for, but really any company that has a supply chain and is moving goods, we've done projects in these areas. And Sam mentioned it, but really when we say we're an end-to-end supply chain design and consulting firm, what that means is we can work from strategy through engineering and also digital. So in strategy, it's things like network design, transportation studies, inventory allocation, and optimization, really designing the 30,000-foot view of your supply chain. And then in engineering, the focus of what we're talking about today, this is inside the four walls, looking at material flows, automation, IT systems, and how those all work together hand in hand. And then our digital practice is really bringing in this industry 4.0 data science, custom tools and applications using AI, machine learning to do prescriptive and predictive analytics in the work that we do. So diving then into what we're going to talk about today. We have some key considerations, which is kind of the structure of how we're going to set up our time today, and some risks that we want to avoid when we are designing a supply chain material handling solution. So in these key considerations, we've got 3 things. One is operational requirements and facility constraints. So this is your data, your existing facility or new facility, technology and vendor specific considerations. So when you have the solution in mind, now you want to actually select a specific technology and vendor. What do we need to be considering there? And then, of course, project management and coordination, often overlooked. is a very important part of implementing whatever solution you come up with. And all of this that we're talking about today is to avoid some very specific risks associated with, as I'm sure many of you know, new material handling solution. So not meeting performance expectations, that's a big one, right? You have all these expectations, especially when we're talking about automation, that you're going to have high performance. We want to make sure we meet that expectation. Project delays are a big one. Sometimes these can be mitigated, and how do we do that? Exceeding the project budget, I'm sure, is of top concern to you and your finance people in your companies. And a big one also is low buy-in and adoption rate. So how do we do change management effectively to get everyone on board using the new solution in the most effective way possible? So that's what we want to talk about today. That's how we've structured our presentation today, these considerations to avoid these specific project risks. So with that, I'll hand it over then to Sam to go through the next section here.
Thank you, Kate. There's a little bit of delay in the screen, so hopefully everybody can see. All right, we are going to start with operational requirements and facility constraints. And this is an incredibly important chapter because ultimately it's the foundation and the environment for which you're building and designing and ultimately implementing any of your solutions. And these projects, big or small, they always start with data collection and data analysis, right? Somewhere or another, there's always an element of data that needs to be a part of these projects in order to decide how big does my solution need to be? How many do I need? Right? What's the throughput? What's the inventory that we need to store, or the throughput that we need to serve? So it's really, really data intensive. And this is fantastic. It obviously gives you a lot of information, but it is almost always historical looking, right? You go back 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, pull your data to understand what is the behavior of the facility over the last period of time, right? And this is fantastic, but this historical data obviously tells you how your operational functioned in the past. It doesn't necessarily tell you where you need to be in the future. So through all of our projects, when we work with our clients, we really push to understand customer behavior patterns, and also what is your organization's customer proposition, right? If you're a distribution center, your customer is your end users, right? If it's an e-com, it could be somebody who's receiving a package, right? If you're B2B or wholesale, right? It could be that other company, it could be that other warehouse that you're shipping to. So what is your customer proposition, right? When they place an order, how quickly do they expect to receive product? Is there a certain service level that you're offering or that they expect? Is there certain packaging that they're expecting it to come in, right? This is your customer proposition. And this is really how they start to experience your organization. And these distribution centers or these manufacturing plants are oftentimes, a major interface point with these customers. So we often have to ask questions around, well, okay, it's good to know what your data says, right? But what do we need going forward? Do we need to have a more strict or a tighter service level? For example, we have some customers that really wanted to implement a 2-hour service level from order drop to ship. So you can understand that this is incredibly demanding on the operation, and it really has a big impact on the requirements that any sort of automated solution, be it a picking solution, be it AGVs, be it an ASRS, needs to help provide. So this is really, really important to understand to make sure that you're able to piece these two things together. So your facility and your solution is not just great at fulfilling and executing what you guys used to do, but also puts you in a position to be able to evolve into the future as your customer proposition grows. Now, there's always a translation from data to design parameters. And what do I mean by design parameters? This is the set of data that you or a material handling company is going to use to physically size their equipment. So when you look at your inventory data, you may realize that you have a certain amount of pallets or a certain amount of bins or cases that you have in stock. You would not necessarily want to size one-to-one your pallet racking, for example, with the amount of pallets you have to store, right? You always have some element of storage utilization, right? You need to have some empty slots there so that you can put away product or pull product out efficiently. You also need to think about things like, I have a column grid in my facility, and I'm expecting to lose some elements of my storage locations due to a column grid. You have to add a lot of these considerations to get to ultimately your design parameters, which would be, I need to make sure that I have 10,000 locations for single deep racking, right? And this is based on 7,500 pallets plus a pallet or a storage utilization plus some pallet locations lost to racking. So this is really how you evolve from what your data is telling you to what your design parameters need to be that you ultimately need to buy and then install. Finally, growth. Growth is something that we work with our clients on a lot. And too often growth is just taken as an input, maybe from sales, maybe from finance, wherever it is. And we extrapolate way out into the future, right? You want to design for future state. So maybe this is 3 years, maybe this is 5 years, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 10, whatever that may be. But as we all know, nobody forecasts and predicts their growth perfectly. So what we would always recommend, and this is really to make sure you prevent oversizing or undersizing your facility or your solution, is to run a series of sensitivities around your growth parameters. So normally you may get an expected growth rate year over year, right? This could be in terms of inventory, it could be store growth, it could be order growth, it could be sales growth, whatever this looks like. But we always would recommend looking at this in a number of different ways. You have your expected, you have a pessimistic growth. Growth doesn't end up being exactly what you expected, it's a little bit short. And maybe you also have an aggressive growth plan. So what happens if it's more than you expect? How do you think about this from a facility design or an automation selection and implementation perspective? One of the things that we always like to look at is, if you have a solution and you want to look at solutions and vendors that can provide scalable solutions, but also expandable, and what's the difference here, and what do I mean as it relates to the growth conversation? So you always want to be careful about, obviously, the amount of money that you're spending on the solutions, and wherever you can defer capital, that's always great, right? And the business always love this is if you're able to build for year 3, but then can you scale to year 5, right? Within the current confines of what you've built, can you scale quickly, right? So can you scale, for example, from your pessimistic growth rate to more your expected growth rate, right? Without having to substantially change the infrastructure of your building or the infrastructure of whatever solution that you built. So if you have an AMR-based solution, this might mean adding some more AMRs, right? But it means you're able to scale your solution up. We also then think about expansion. And do we want to plan on expansion and have expansion paths from a expected growth rate to a more aggressive growth rate, right? So having space available either within the building or outside the building to expand your operation in order to meet these more aggressive targets, right? So we oftentimes think about scalability and expansion in a couple of different ways. So moving on, we do a lot of projects. Some of them are greenfield, some of them are brownfield. The greenfield ones, let's say these are easier, right? And for those of you who have existing operations and you're working on implementing a solution, I'm sure you would love to be working in a greenfield environment where, form follows function. You can design kind of whatever we want. The space isn't limited, but we know that this isn't reality oftentimes. And oftentimes you have to think about, how can I find a solution that fits within my current infrastructure, my current constraints? And there's a lot of watch outs here, right? Obviously, from a footprint and layout perspective, there's a lot of things to keep in mind. Building clear height, column spacing, dock doors, break rooms, bathrooms, whatever that may look like, right? Traffic aisles, pedestrian walkways. From a starting point, though, the amount of times that we see an operations layout is not up to date. So you get an AutoCAD layout of your facility to understand, where's my racking, where's my picking, where's my sortation, or where's my manufacturing lines. Always make sure that this is as up to date as possible. Normally, organizations do not have somebody sitting there day in and day out updating, modifying this layout, right? So there's quite a bit of due diligence that needs to be done to make sure from a layout perspective, you fully understand what you're working within today. So when you hand it over to a vendor, they have a precise and real-time view of what the facility currently looks like. Traffic aisles and pedestrian walkways are one thing that we normally don't see on these types of layouts. So this is really critical. Where you place your high labor areas and your high labor activities is really important in order to minimize non-value added working time from your team and from your operator. So if you don't have your traffic aisles or your pedestrian walkways mapped, we'd always encourage adding this. So when you have an area which is high labor that you know you're going to need to have quite a few people at, can you keep this close to a pedestrian walkway so that's easily accessible? Or can you have it close to the break rooms or bathrooms so when they go out for lunch, right, they don't have to walk all the way across the facility, but they can maybe walk a short way, get there quickly, and they don't lose a quarter of their lunch break or their lunch hour walking to and from the facility. Finally, when we think about utilities and building restrictions, one thing that we have seen be an issue a number of times is companies not understanding the available electrical load from their generators, right? This is often taken for, can be often taken for granted. So we'd really, really recommend working with your facilities or your construction group to understand how much electrical load are you using today out of the capacity that you have available. And if you are to implement any sort of new automated solution, what is the electrical load required out of that? This is something, while it may seem like vendors can give this information to you relatively quickly, normally they can't. This is something that they have to do on the backside to calculate what this means. So electrical load is something that we often see overlooked. The same question, the same topic goes for fire suppression and understanding and making sure, A, that you're able to meet and adhere to all of your local regulations around fire suppression and your insurance providers' regulations around fire suppression, but also your water tanks, right? Do you have enough, right? If you need to add more racking and more sprinkler levels, how do we make sure you have the right water tank capacity in order to serve all of these? These are things which can add substantial costs to your operation later down the line if you don't think about these things early on. And it can cause serious budget issues. Obviously, you need to think about total cost of ownership, right? So energy consumption, maintenance, these are all things which load into your total cost of ownership. We recently had a client who wasn't thinking about floor load tolerance, but was building a large shuttle system. We found out later that they had to spend $1 million just on piling for the framework of the shuttle system. So this is a substantial number that needs to be thought about early on. Finally, IT. IT might be the single biggest reason for project delays and change orders, and it is also the biggest enabler for most material handling solutions. We would always, always recommend that when you go to market and you start talking to vendors, that you have your system and your digital requirements mapped out as much as possible. So this means defining your messaging structure, your data flows, or any integration standards that your company or your organization may have. The reason is because the vendor on the other side is where you don't have this information, they're going to have to fill gaps and they're going to make assumptions. And too often, especially if you don't have the right IT, local, or system experts on your team, these are gaps that are very, very easy to miss and overlook until you get later on during message testing, when you have people on the floor, when you have vehicles on the floor, and you're trying to go live and these gaps show up. So we would really recommend a high amount of due diligence upfront on the IT in terms of what your current infrastructure requires, your current systems require, and what you expect to see on the vendor side in terms of what their WMS, their WCS, or their robot manager system provides. One thing that we've seen a lot become more common, especially in more complex environments or in manufacturing environments where you really cannot starve the line, right? And you can't have production facilities or lines go down, is a more frequently people are using emulation as a tool during the pre-installation phase. So emulation, for anybody that's not familiar with it, high level, it's a virtual environment where you're able to create duplicates of maybe your WMS in your new system's WCS to test messaging back and forth to make sure that when your WMS requests a pallet, right, that their WCS acknowledges that message, sends it back saying, got it, confirmed. This is the activity and the messaging I'm going to do internally to execute on that, right? So emulation is something you can really do during the pre-installation phase to test and de-risk a lot of the activities that are going on during go live and ramp up. And so IT can be sometimes a minor cost in terms of the total capex of the solution, but it by far causes the highest number of change orders, and we always recommend our clients to plan accordingly. All right, so a quick case study. This is going to be of a site master plan that we did at a global consumer goods manufacturing facility. So what we were seeing in this project, where this client was adding a number of new product lines as well as a number of new manufacturing lines, where they were seeing increased production volume, and their logistics operation was entirely manual. So they were having a hard time both finding and scaling their contract work labor force to be able to support all of these new lines and all the material movements. As a result, their inventory was also skyrocketing, and so they were often using a lot of outside storage. So we went through our typical site master plan process, and we identified an automation concept, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about on the next page, in order to automate a lot of the material handling movements for manufacturing line delivery, line takeaway, and line return. All in all, this was about 15 weeks from start to end for the actual design process, not the implementation. But there was around 12 million in potential labor savings and 4 million in transportation and offsite storage savings. So all in all, we're talking about close to $16 million that was in scope for savings here. So there was a lot of money on the table, and it was really, really important that we got this right. So ultimately, what was implemented was an AGV system to move and transport pallets from their warehouse areas up to their lines and back. And the image on the top right shows a high-level view of their layout. And in the green triangles, you have a lot of the warehouse pick and drop points, and in the orange, you have a lot of the production pick and drop points. So the first thing that you can see is this is not a nice, clean layout where travel paths are straight. There's a lot of intersection. There's a lot of right-hand turns. There's a lot of left-hand turns. And so this was really challenging, and we had a couple of issues and risks that we had to mitigate against. The first was on fleet sizing, right? So obviously, in any manufacturing environment, you can never starve your lines. And as we looked at historical transactional data, we realized that the transactions and the material movements were to support a 65 to 75% OEE manufacturing environment, but the facility has a target of 85%, and that was their goal over the next 3 years. So this was a very good instance where looking at only historical transactional data would not have given us the right information to size and implement a fleet that needed to meet an 85% OEE. So this was really, really important. We also see that there were spikes throughout a day during change orders, right? So you do not have flat, constant volume throughout the day. When you have change orders, this creates a spike in material requests, right? So you have this OEE target that we have to meet. We also have to make sure any fleet can support these changeover and these peaks and troughs throughout the day. We also had a lot of risks around vehicle routing and navigation that we had to work through. First of all, just walking through, we found, hey, a number of the doors going to production areas that these vehicles were going through were not tall enough. I have kind of a stock image of what this type of vehicle could be. It was a reach AGV, so they have very tall masks that can be 10 to 12 feet tall. So the doorways weren't appropriately clear. And the cameras and the sensors were detecting these as an obstacle. We also still had a lot of pedestrian and vehicle walkways. So we had to really be thinking about a lot of the intersection points, and we had to plan and test around how did we want to have our pedestrians walking through the facility to and from the lines, and what were the intersection points between our automated vehicles and manual vehicles, and what was the protocol at those environments. And finally, on a safety side, safety was paramount. Safety is one thing that we could never cut any corners on. But it was really important that we fully understood going into the vendor selection what were the appropriate safety standards the facility was going to require us to abide by, be it ANSI or ISO standards. And these impact fleet performance, right? This was really critical for us. We also had to do on-site ramp testing. So in this case, there was a ramp, about an 8-degree ramp going from one part of the facility to another. And we thought from a functionality and capability perspective, a lot of these vendors could do it, but ultimately we had to decide to bring vendors on site, pay them to come on site to test that they could do this. We had them run a pilot. And this was really important. Before we signed any contracts, we really were able to say without a shadow of a doubt that we had a series of vendors that could perform this functionality. And this was really important to providing leadership a lot of confidence that when they sign a contract, we're going to be able to execute on this end to end. Okay, Kate, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sam. All right. So now that we've talked about how do you design the solution, right? What are the things you need to consider? What's the data and the different customer requirements to take into account? We're going to jump into how do you select the right specific technology and supplier to really meet that solution and get what you designed for, right? So Sam touched on it a little bit already, but two of the most important things, especially in the time we're living in now, is having a solution that is scalable and flexible, right? So when we come up with a conceptual design, it is usually a static design for the planning horizon year, right? So maybe that's 5 years from now, 7 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever it may be. We want to make sure that that solution, one, we can scale up to it, as Sam mentioned, to really grow with the growth of the company. But also then how do you scale more tactically to account for peaks, right? So if that's seasonality or it's, certain times of day, is your solution itself scalable? And really, this goes into kind of that modular equipment mindset of how easy is it for you to add additional equipment, whether that's adding additional vehicles, if it's AGVs or AMRs, adding additional aisles, maybe if it's a, automated storage and retrieval system with cranes or shuttles. How quickly can you scale that solution with minimal disruption? That's a big consideration to have when you're selecting a specific technology. And also to know when to expand, right? So when you're doing that initial design, you should come up with some thresholds to say, when we reach X volume, we need to be already thinking about the next expansion. That's our threshold point, knowing the timing and the lead time that it takes to really get that next step in your, growth path, how long that takes to get that implemented. You should work back from that to have your threshold of when you need to expand. And it might not be a year or a time period. It might be a volume. It might be a point in your business plan where we know, okay, now we're on to the next step and already have that designed into the solution. The other big consideration is flexibility. So of course, we are going to have a specific growth that we're designing for, a specific planning year with specific requirements and considerations, but you need to be flexible, right? Things change, growth requirements change, customer requirements change. So any sort of customization that you put onto your solution potentially could limit the amount of flexibility that you have, right? If you have a really customized solution, it might take longer to implement another aisle or add new vehicles, right? Because you're going to need to match that same level of customization. So really it's a trade-off between being hyper customized to your exact operation and requirements versus having some flexibility in there for changes and updates. And this also goes into the type of equipment and solution that you're implementing. So sometimes, we like to say that there's more flexible solutions like robotics and AMRs that's easier to change more quickly. And then there's other maybe sometimes more robust and you can get maybe higher throughput, but it has really fixed infrastructure with conveyance and, like Sam mentioned, pilings that are needed and floor loads, right? So it takes longer if you want to change that sort of fixed automation. And of course, IT, we talked about it. You need to consider this and the flexibility. Again, this goes back to a lot of customization, right? How much customization are you building into that integration, and how easy could it be or would it be if you needed to make changes or you needed to add on to your solution? Next thing is when you're selecting a specific vendor to supply your material handling equipment. Some of the things to consider there is not only looking at the technology that they provide, but the company as a whole, right? This is going to be your long-term partner, most likely, year over year of design and implementation and support. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the company as a whole, whether that's financially, their security and cyber compliance, whether that's their safety standards, and how does their culture match your culture, and are they going to be a long-term fit as a partner? And then, of course, proposed budget. How do they handle change orders? How do they foresee, different costs when you're getting quotes from them? Are they breaking it down and showing the implementation and, different transportation costs? What does that look like? And then in general, what level of automation do you need? Are your vendors really recommending what's needed based on requirements, or all of the fancy bells and whistles? And maybe you want all the fancy bells and whistles, and do they have that capability and that catalog to be able to support additional future automation that you'd like to implement? So really, what does their entire capability look like? And then are you thinking about your processes? We often say that you can automate a bad process and it's still a bad process. So the foundation of everything that you should be doing when you're looking at a new solution is, what's the process that I'm optimizing, and how does this improve with automation? And maybe there's some base layer of process optimization that you want to do first, and you and the vendor should be thinking about that together. And then, of course, project risks. How are you going to handle exceptions? You should already plan that there will be exceptions. It's not always going to be happy path. So when you're going through the detail design and implementation phases with the vendor, you should be thinking about, okay, here's my happy path, here's my normal flow. What are the possible exceptions, and how can we mitigate these and already plan for these when we're in go live and post go live as well? And then, like I mentioned, make sure you are considering not only the initial cost of the equipment itself, the steel, the racking, the robots, whatever it is, but also project management costs, the daily rates and working hours of the project team, the total timeline, and how long that's going to cost you from an implementation standpoint, and then all of the kind of total cost of ownership things that we mentioned before. So once you've got your vendor selected and you're ready to go live in operation, what are some of the things that you need to consider for long-term, day-to-day operational readiness? So first one that is sometimes overlooked is spare parts and maintenance. So what is the plan for having spare parts and maintenance capabilities on site versus relying on your vendor, your supplier? And how much do you want to be able to do in-house versus having your partner fulfill those needs? And this is going to affect your uptime, right? So what's your target uptime? How quickly do you want to be able to get things back up and running when you do have a downtime issue? Can you identify maybe specific high wear items or really critical parts that you want to be able to have on site and have maintenance techs trained on how to replace those items? Maybe you want your own maintenance personnel to be able to do preventative, predictive maintenance. what does that plan look like? You should be thinking about already in the early design phases and discussions with your vendors. And then, of course, training and support. So this goes along with that, right? So detailed maintenance manuals if you want to have on-site capabilities, or maybe you want to have or maybe you want to have 24/7 access to technical support from your vendor, right? So all of this will affect, of course, the project pricing and solution pricing, but what's your company's strategy on how you want to operate this equipment? Because it might be a totally new capability, new functions that you have to come up with in your team to really run and manage and operate an automated system if you've never done this before. And of course, we like to say always plan for the unexpected. So plan for system failures. What are you going to do in the event of downtime? Have that plan in place so you're not scrambling as much as possible at the end to get things back up and running, and have a plan for things like power outages, right? If now all of a sudden you have to operate everything with electricity, what are you going to do in the event of a power outage? So also have a little case study here to highlight some of the points that we've talked about so far. So for this specific client, this is a industrial manufacturer, and the challenge that they were facing was they had recently decided that they were going to consolidate multiple warehouses into a brand new plant attached distribution center that was going to fulfill both production orders and customer orders. So in the past, they would have these things separate, but they decided, some of their warehouses were aging and low ceiling heights, and infrastructure was getting older, and so they wanted to modernize, and they had this brand new plant with a brand new warehouse. So they said, okay, let's try to put everything together, centrally located, and fulfill both production and customers. In order to do that, they went with an automated storage and retrieval system for bin storage in AutoStore, and thought, okay, we can have really high picking performance with this. So we should be able to have this consolidation and fulfill both in this one facility. But shortly after they went live, the facility became overwhelmed. They had order backlogs, shipping delays, system performance really was not meeting expectations, and they were not getting the performance that they were expecting out of the system. So they were having to prioritize, do we fulfill customer orders or production orders, and having downtime on the lines, right? Which we know is never a good thing, but you also need to serve your customers and get them their products, right? So all of this, and they also wanted to grow 3 to 7% per year. So really kind of in a pickle there of how do we turn this around and get back up to that performance that we need, not only for today, but also for the growth. So what we did, we came in and did a full diagnostic of what's going on in terms of space, in terms of systems, in terms of automation and slotting, really like get down to the root causes of these inefficiencies across the layout, the systems, and the workforce as well. What are the standard operating procedures? How are the employees operating this new automation system? So then developed solutions to close those gaps. And one of those was exploring also potential expansion, or looking at maybe going back to a decentralized fulfillment strategy, having warehouse separate from production. So some of the things that we saw were happening here. There was a misalignment between the AutoStore and the WMS in terms of waiving of orders and replenishment strategy and slotting, and it was causing delays and inventory issues. There was some slotting issues, and replenishment strategies were inefficient in that there was things slotted in multiple locations and maybe not the right location for the order profile or the SKU characteristics. Also, some serious concerns with staging and storage area sizing and the data that was used to do this initial sizing. And then, like I mentioned, SKUs being picked from multiple locations. So they didn't really have a reserve storage versus pick location. It was sort of multiple different storage technologies stored everywhere, and some inefficiencies in where and how to pick things. And then a very green staff that wasn't used to automation. The people that had been there for a while were used to manual operations, and they had a lot of turnover as well in some of their day-to-day staff. So needed help there. And then help also with how their supervisors operated the space as well. So some of the solutions were really digging into that order waiving and replenishment logic between the AutoStore and the WMS to streamline that order flow and have a better prioritization. And then improve the slotting strategy between the manual and the automated picking and get that really resolved and clear distinction. And then we also designed and implemented a facility expansion. They just simply needed more space on site. So how much more space? What's the technology we're adding in there? Are we adding automation and manual? We ended up actually adding both. And then consolidated the pick zones to boost efficiency. So making sure that when we have our super high movers, they're in a small area to reduce manual, walking and picking time, and have a clear order flow path. And then delivered targeted training and management practices and defined the standards of oversight. So what are the KPIs that you should be looking at? Are you doing a daily Gemba walk? Are you having a team meeting on the floor? Things like this that are really more about operational strategies to manage the day-to-day. And with this, some of the results and impact, we were able to expand the facility and eliminate those space constraints. Luckily, they had some space on site. We closed those operational gaps with staging and automation and IT and material flow, and enabled that really end-to-end fulfillment for production and customer orders from that single unified facility. So we didn't have to go offsite again, and designed it to support the additional growth for the future as well. And with that, these strategies that we implemented, so it was things like the replenishment strategy and picking strategy and what do you actually put into the automation, we were able to improve the pick rates by 80% and reduce that order backlog by 50% in under 3 months. So that was a really big win. And most of it was, keeping the infrastructure and the automation that they had chosen, the solution they had chosen, but just changing and tweaking how you're operating it. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sam.
Thank you again, Kate. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk a little bit about project management and stakeholder gaps. Unfortunately, we have a lot of our clients that can often overlook what we call change management. And it's sometimes seen as this soft factor, but really change management and appropriate change management starts very early on in your project, right? Even when you're trying to get your project through the approval stage, even before anything's on site, right? And actual physical changes are happening to the operation. And project management obviously becomes a really big element of this. And for us, the way we think about this is when you're talking about putting your project plan together, and you need to think about what do you need, who do you need involved, right? How do you organize a project plan? How do you deliver this? Then how do you change this, communicate this plan effectively to support your change management strategy? The way I think about this is really keep it simple, right? It's called plan the work and then work the plan. Basically, that's really, really what we would do and really what we would always emphasize, right? The more planning that you can do up front, when you get down into an execution stage, it makes it all that much easier. So there's a couple of essentials here that we've talked about, right? A roadmap with clear objectives, timelines, deliverables, really proactive risk mitigation. So oftentimes we get everybody on our project team together to throw at the beginning of the project What are all the potential risks? Let's get all of these on the board. And normally at the beginning of a project, before it's even started, we may have 10 to 15 to 20 risks identified that we're able to say, okay, we know that we can mitigate against these. Some of these are out of our control, which we're not going to be able to address, but we can keep in mind, and maybe we can plan and think about this from a resiliency perspective. And then obviously, as the project continues, right, more and more risks come up. And really foster alignment and collaboration among team members to really continue to push this communication and accountability. Resource allocation also becomes really, really important. When these projects move out of the vendor selection and into the implementation stage, all of a sudden we have a lot of work streams that form up, right? So you maybe have an automation work stream as an example. Maybe you have a facilities or construction work stream, 3PL, operations, IT, network planning. You may have 5, 6, 10 different work streams. Um, so you really need to make sure from a resource allocation and effort perspective, because all of these work streams are critical, that you're able to get alignment on having the right people on your team at the right time so that when, rubber hits the road, you have the right resources available in the right locations. So we're always thinking about this in terms of make sure your milestones and your gateways, right? Your major gateways that you need to proceed, you need to get approval on, make sure these are clear and you're always working towards these. And then a contingency plan, right? What happens if you don't make it to those gateways on time, right? Or you get there and you have budget overrun. Contingency plans are really, really important from a project management perspective. And also as you're, trying to implement and roll out this change, right? When you have contingency plans available and ready, the organization in your team is quicker and it's easier to adopt. Okay, so obviously, why does it matter, right? Minimizing disruption, stakeholder buy-in. This one is really important, and as I mentioned, this starts even before you get your projects approved. And honestly, a lot of change management needs to start early. Oftentimes, people in the supply chain, the logistics space, they may see an issue before anybody else in the organization sees it, right? Oftentimes, they're the ones that start to see, the supply chain disruptions, right? The delays in shipping coming from overseas, right? Issues with customer orders, right? So oftentimes they're the first to see it. And so oftentimes you're then recommending solutions, or the way the business needs to go to be able to handle these, but maybe the rest of the organization doesn't see this quite yet, or the rest of the organization scoffs a little bit at the budget. So change management early on is really critical to get stakeholder buy-in. And the way that we like to do this is, stop thinking in terms of supply chain and logistics and start thinking in terms of business language and finance, right? And this is really important to make sure you bridge those gaps. Training and adoption for your operators is incredibly important, because this obviously yields efficiency gains. And as you have those efficiency gains, once you've implemented, communicate this, spread this back. And this is obviously always done through, one of the ways this is done is through feedback loops, right? And this isn't necessarily something that's only done once you're in the process or in the stage of implementation, right? But you should be going through consistent feedback loops within your own internal team, maybe within your organization, but also with the vendor and the supplier. Too many times we see, because there's, despite vendors selling hardware or selling systems, right? You're working with another organization and you're working with another organization's people and team. So this is still very much a people business. And one of the things that is often a point of disruption or tension is just when a project manager on one side and a project manager the other side just don't get along. And maybe they have different personalities and their approach to project management is very different. This can create a lot of tension. It can potentially create hostility. And obviously, you have situations where you may request a new project manager. So one of the things that we would always recommend is when you're in the process of selecting that vendor, interview that vendor's project manager, making sure there and your project manager sit in the same room, talk to each other so that your approaches are aligned and you know that this is something that you can work with even when things go south, right? And you guys have to problem solve together. You're able to approach this in a way of saying, we're going to fix this together rather than blaming, right? Looking at this, as Kate said, as a partnership, this is really, really important. So, a couple of major elements of an effective change management plan. We already mentioned this a little bit. Make sure you have clear objectives, right? Always revisit, why are we doing this and what is the progress we're making, right? So maybe it's, we know that we need additional storage capacity or throughput capacity, or we can't hire enough people and we need automation. We need to supplement automation just to make sure the people that we have today can do more, right? Completely reiterate or constantly reiterate your purpose, right? And communicate those outcomes and benefits to everybody. I already talked about this. This stakeholder analysis is really important. Making sure you understand, who are you impacting? How are their lives changing, and what's in it for them? This is one of the most, easiest but impactful way of communicating change and getting buy-in is to make sure you communicate what's in it for them and how their lives are going to be easier, right? And executing this across a communication strategy, training and support, making sure your whole team is well equipped to go through and see through all of these change and be able to operate effectively. Your implementation timeline, your implementation approach is really, really important. Oftentimes, what we see is, companies that have this big bang, right? They want to go live with everything all at one time. This isn't always successful, or there's certainly more risk around this and more opportunities for things to go wrong. When you have more of a phased approach, right? You're able to pilot or roll out in a small area, become an expert, learn. As you move on to the next area, you can reapply. You're that much more and more efficient, right? This is really, really effective. And as you continue to monitor and evaluate, you'll see those results and you'll see those efficiency gains. And obviously, sustaining the changes is really, really important. Okay. So again, another case study. This was a fashion e-commerce company, a very, very high volume DC, and this was a really complex operation that we were stepping into. So they had two separate facilities in Montreal. One was basically serving their inbound operations. They were receiving pallets inbound, while the other one was a manual fulfillment operation, and they wanted to consolidate these two facilities into one distribution and fulfillment environment. They were growing heavily, so you can see the image on the far right. So they were averaging something around 30% growth year over year. This might be a big number to some of you, but in this industry, it's not uncommon to see these types of growth year over year as certain products or certain brands become more popular. And this company was going through something similar, right? So they were talking about, almost more than tripling their business over a number of years. So this was really important to implement in order to absorb this growth and gain that market share. So obviously we need to work with them on developing the design, make sure they can improve and do better than they are today on productivity, efficiency, and safety and quality. But this wasn't just a design project. We were basically helping from design all the way through implementation. And as we pulled everybody and everything together, we realized that there was a lot of complexity in order to actually designing the solution and then getting it implemented. Ultimately, when we eventually did, we were able to provide that 400% increase in capacity, and we did this really by implementing a number of major solutions. The first was a multi-shuttle. The second was pouch sorter. In order to go from 3.4 million units shipped per year up to 16.3 million, right? So we nearly quadrupled the business and the throughput we were able to serve. And also, we were able to see a substantial productivity increase as well, and nearly a 25% increase. But the reason I wanted to bring this case study forward specifically is because we had some very substantial project management and change management challenges here. So the first is we had 10 different work streams, right? I talked about earlier all the potential work streams that you could have, right? So we are dealing with a lot of different people that have stake in this project and constantly having to manage and work with them and make sure we understand what are they doing at all times? How does their activities, align and fall into the project plan? Because there's always often times interdependencies between the two, right? One work stream needs to produce one deliverable in order for another work stream to start their deliverable, as an example. We also have global SMEs. We had people in Canada, we had people in the US, and we had some people in Europe, right, on different time zones, all who were incredibly important to the project. So managing and working with this was a challenge that we had to overcome, and obviously work with the entire team in order to find, times that everybody could meet, right? How do we prevent, a 6 a.m. meeting for the US to make a nice lunchtime meeting for Europe, right? So we had to find some common ground here. Personality clashes. This was partially from a vendor and a customer perspective, but it was also we have different cultures, different backgrounds at play. So this was really one of the things that we were constantly managing. Limited resources on a vendor side. This was a situation where it wasn't just the hardware they were bringing in, but there was a WMS that was being implemented, a new WMS, all from the same provider. One of the things that we've learned over the years is that not always, but sometimes these large material handling companies, they have a large equipment labor base, so they have the right people to do the design, right, of the equipment, the installation of the equipment, right? But their IT, their WMS group might be a little bit smaller, right? Because oftentimes these vendors have gone out and they've acquired other companies, they've acquired the WMS, they've acquired the IT component, right? So they're not necessarily able to operate on the same scale. So limited resources was a serious challenge in order of dealing with, the vendor has their own priorities and they have a stream of other projects that they're also working on, right? And how do you manage and find time to be able to say, this project has to take priority versus that project has to take priority, and you don't always have their resources available to you all the time. And we were at for a period of time dual running from a WMS perspective. So one part of the operation was on the old WMS, one part of the operation was on the new WMS. So from an operations and an IT perspective, this was incredibly complicated. So we had to map out almost day by day, even sometimes to a shift by shift level, how we were transitioning from the old one to a new one. And of course, we're really working with short and discrete timelines to implement, right? We didn't necessarily have, 24 months to just, slow roll this thing to get it up, right? There was expectation from a business perspective around being able to have the facility ready before peak, right? And really 3 months before peak so that you could ramp up and prepare and the facility could be well oiled and running well. So we had to be able to manage a lot of activity in short spurts when we could find time available on the site. Okay. So I think maybe there's one or two questions. We have 4 minutes left. Mahika, if there's any questions, happy to, if you want to raise those, happy to speak to them.
Yes, for sure. One of the questions that came up was, do you typically see automation projects managed by engineers or by more experienced project managers?
Oftentimes, I can maybe take this, and Kate, happy to get your thoughts as well. It really sometimes depends on the organization. So a lot of the let's say the larger organizations that we work with have a dedicated project management layer, right? That regardless of whatever the project is, they're doing project management. This is great because they bring the toolkit, right? And they bring the project management skills. And this is really important. The challenge is they're not always experts on the topic, right? They maybe have never implemented automation before. So we see quite a bit of both. Ultimately, in terms of what's gone right, what's gone wrong, which one is better and worse, I've seen both have success. I've seen both have challenges. Ultimately, though, the project manager is really important, but you have to have the broader team around them. You have to make sure you have the skill sets around them to basically enable and allow them to do their job.
Yeah, and I would maybe add to that, Sam, it also, if you're deciding which strategy to go forward with, depends on the size, scale, and complexity of the project, right? If you're implementing a small automation solution, maybe it's a couple AMRs in existing facility, maybe your engineering team can handle this and they can fulfill the project management role capabilities, perfectly fine. But if you're getting into these really large projects where you're maybe building a new building, so there's, architectural construction teams, and you're also changing things with IT. So you're then, working with IT teams, and then you also have the logistics and material handling solution. And you come up to this scenario where you have all these work streams, and then the coordination, between and among them becomes its own full-time job. This is where that strong PMO role really is
Mhm.
needed for success, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I know we're almost close to time, but one question that comes up a lot is how much does this usually save clients in the long run? Some of these risk mitigation strategies and considerations.
Kate, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple different types of savings, right? So some of the risks that we talked about at the beginning would be kind of the inverse of these. So savings in change orders is a big one, right? That's direct actual cost savings. And this depends. I've seen, examples where if we had maybe done some of these things ahead of time, like look at better data or have different requirements, we could have saved 5-10%, right? And then there's time savings and really the opportunity cost of not having your solution up and running, right? So you can take a project from maybe 24 months down to 18 months if you do some proper planning and have some of these strategies that we talked about in place. So it depends, but definitely there are specific savings in time and budget and effort if you can think about some of these things early on in the planning process.
Awesome, thank you. I think I see one more question. Do you think that from a strategic point of view, if you have a lot of sites, is it better to go with the same MHS or SW providers, or is it better to diversify?
Ooh, this is a really good question. More often than not, it depends what a lot is, right? More often than not, we see diversification and recommend the diversification. Obviously, it's beneficial if you can get to a point where you have scale with any one provider and you can negotiate, discounts based on scale. Hey, we're going to offer you 2, 3, 4, 5 sites. A lot of the larger companies that we work with, and we would honestly oftentimes recommend something similar is, if you're dealing with the scale of 10 to 20 sites, you probably want to have at least 3 or 4 vendors involved. If you're having on a scale of 2 or 3 sites, this is where one vendor is probably easier to manage, I would say. But we definitely would recommend that diversity, right? It also keeps them competitive, right? So they don't feel like, on the 5th or 6th site that they can upcharge you because they know you're not doing business with anybody else.
That looks like all of the questions.
Okay. Well, yep.
So thank
Go ahead.
you everyone for joining us today. That brings us to the end of our webinar. As a reminder, you will have the opportunity to get this recording, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.